The smell of lilies always made me uneasy. But that afternoon, standing in the doorway of St. Michael's Cathedral in downtown Toronto, I realized I'd been wrong about why. It wasn't the flowers, it was what they meant. I shouldn't have been there. I want to be clear about that. I was a first-year nursing student, working a second job as a catering server, and my supervisor had handed me the assignment that morning with nothing more than an address, a dress code, black, formal, no exceptions, and the words, "Important client. Don't speak unless spoken to." What she hadn't told me was whose funeral it was. The cathedral was full. Not the way ordinary funerals are full, a few pews of elderly relatives dabbing at their eyes, maybe some coworkers in the back looking at their phones. This was different. Men in suits that cost more than my rent stood in every corner. Women with jewelry that caught the light from the stained glass windows sat perfectly still, not crying, just watching. There were 2 men near the front doors who weren't mourners at all. I could tell because their eyes never stopped moving. I kept my head down and did what I was paid to do. Refilled water glasses. Adjusted napkins on the reception tables set up in the cathedral hall. Tried not to stare. The casket was open. That was the thing that pulled me, in the end, not morbid curiosity. I was training to be a nurse. I'd already seen enough in my clinical rotations to know that death was just a fact, not a mystery. It was something else. Something that snagged at the part of my brain, trained to notice when something was wrong. I told myself I was just walking to the far side of the hall to check the water pitchers. Which was technically true. It just happened to take me past the casket. He was a large man. Dark hair, silver at the temples. Well-dressed, the way men are well-dressed when someone else has chosen their clothes for them. His hands were folded across his chest, and his face was completely still. Except, I stopped walking. His chest had moved, just barely, just once. But I was close enough, and I was trained enough, and I was paying attention, the way you learn to pay attention when someone's life might depend on it. And his chest had moved. I stood there for 3 full seconds, which felt like a very long time, telling myself I'd imagined it. Then I watched him breathe again. I've thought about that moment a lot since. What I should have done was find the nearest man in a suit and say, quietly, that there might be a medical situation that needed attention. What I did instead was reach out and press 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist. His pulse was slow, but it was there. "Can I help you?" The voice came from directly behind me. I turned around and found myself looking at a man who was approximately the size of a refrigerator, wearing an expression that suggested he'd asked that question before and had rarely meant it in the helpful sense. "He's alive," I said. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it. "I'm sorry?" The man in the casket. I kept my voice very low, because some instinct I couldn't name was telling me that this information should not travel across the room. "He has a pulse. He's breathing. Whatever you think is happening here, this man is not dead." The large man looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the casket. Then he looked back at me with the expression of someone who has just been told something they already knew, but were hoping no one else would notice. "Come with me," he said. His name was Roman Vazari. I found that out later, much later, and not from him. In that first hour, he was simply the man who was not dead, being carried through a side door of St. Michael's Cathedral by 2 men who moved with the efficiency of people accustomed to transporting things that couldn't be discussed. I was carried along in their wake, not quite under duress, not quite by choice. They brought us to a house in Rosedale. I'd grown up in Scarborough, so Rosedale was a different country to me. The kind of neighborhood where the trees are older than most of the people who live there, and the houses sit so far back from the street that you can almost convince yourself they don't exist. This house was stone and dark wood, and it smelled like cedar and something underneath that I couldn't identify. They put him in a room on the ground floor that had clearly been prepared for exactly this situation. Hospital-grade equipment. IV lines already laid out. A man who introduced himself as a physician and did not offer his last name took over immediately. I should have left. Instead, I said, "He was given something. His pupils were unequal when I checked him. You'll want to look for a fast-acting sedative, probably administered in the last 4 hours. His pulse was 42 when I found him, which is too low for a man his size who looks otherwise healthy." The physician stopped what he was doing and looked at me. "You're a nurse?" "Student," I said. "First year, but I'm good at paying attention." He looked at me for another moment. Then he nodded and turned back to his patient, and I stayed. I stayed because the alternative was to walk out the door with information I didn't fully understand yet, into a city where I had no idea what the right thing to do with that information was. I stayed because Roman Vasari was not dead, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to make it appear that he was, and that seemed like the kind of thing that had consequences for anyone who knew about it. And I stayed, if I'm being honest, because some part of me that I'd spent a long time trying to quiet down was very, very interested in finding out what happened next. He woke up 9 hours later. I was sitting in the corner of the room, because no one had told me to leave, and I hadn't been offered anywhere else to go, reading a medical journal I'd found on the shelf that turned out to be from 1987, but was still interesting. The physician had gone somewhere. To sleep, I assumed, and the large man, whose name I'd learned was Brendan, was standing outside the door. Roman Vasari opened his eyes, looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then turned his head and looked directly at me. "You're not one of mine," he said. His voice was rough from the sedative but steady. "No," I said. "I'm the catering staff." Something moved across his face, not quite amusement. "The catering staff. I was working your funeral." He considered this. "And you're still here. I noticed you were breathing." It seemed relevant. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved around the room in the systematic way of someone assessing an environment, not panicking, just cataloging. "Where is Brendan?" "Outside the door." "And Fitzgerald?" "The doctor? He left about 2 hours ago. He said your vitals were stable, and he'd be back in the morning." Roman Vasari pushed himself up onto his elbows with the careful deliberateness of someone who knows they've been sedated and is compensating accordingly. "What's your name?" "Ivy," I said. "Ivy McAllister." "Ivy McAllister." He repeated it like he was filing it somewhere. "And what exactly do you think is happening here, Ivy?" I thought about it. "Honestly, I think someone tried to kill you by making it look like you died naturally. I think your people realized what had happened quickly enough to fake a funeral rather than announce that you'd survived. Which means whoever came after you doesn't know yet that they failed. And I think the fact that I'm still in this house means either that your people are deciding what to do with me, or that you want me here for some reason I haven't figured out yet." He looked at me for a long time. "You're very calm," he said. "I work night shifts in an emergency ward," I said. "Calm is a professional requirement." The next 3 days were the strangest of my life, and my life had already contained some strange things. I called my supervisor and told her I'd had a family emergency. I called my program coordinator at the nursing college and arranged to miss 2 days of clinical. I did not call anyone else, because there was no one else to call. My mother was in Winnipeg. My friends from school were busy with their own rotations, and the particular nature of what I was involved in did not lend itself to casual conversation. Brendan gave me a room. It was a good room, actually. Large windows that looked out over a garden, a bathroom with heated floors, a closet full of women's clothes in what turned out to be approximately my size. I didn't ask about the clothes. Roman Vasari recovered faster than anyone seemed to expect. By the second day, he was walking, slowly, through the garden in the mornings. I started joining him, because I needed air, and because Brendan looked less nervous when I was nearby, which I chose to interpret as a compliment. We didn't talk much at first. He asked me questions about nursing, what I was learning, what I wanted to do with the degree, whether I'd chosen emergency medicine on purpose. I told him about the night I'd decided. I was 17, and my father had had a cardiac event at a hockey game in Mississauga, and the nurse who'd been in the stands had kept him alive until the paramedics arrived. I'd never forgotten watching her hands move, the certainty of them. He listened without interrupting. That was something I noticed about him. He listened the way very few people listen, without organizing his response while you were still talking. "You didn't try to talk me out of this life," he said on the third morning. I looked at him. "It's not my life to talk you out of. Most people who find themselves in this situation feel compelled to try." "I'm not most people," I said, and meant it simply, not as a boast. and I don't know enough about your life to have an opinion worth offering. I know you were nearly killed by someone close to you. I know your people are loyal enough to stage a funeral. I know you haven't asked me to keep quiet about any of this, which means either you trust my judgment or you're not worried about what I'd say. Which do you think it is? I thought about it. Both, maybe. He smiled then. It was the first time I'd seen him smile, and it changed his face in a way that caught me off guard. On the fourth day, someone came to the house who wasn't supposed to. I was in the kitchen, the actual kitchen, not a staff area, because no one had told me I couldn't be there, and I'd started making tea in the mornings as a way of feeling useful. When Brendan appeared in the doorway looking like a man who had received unwelcome news. "Mr. Vasari needs you," he said. Roman was in the main study, standing behind a large desk. Across from him sat a man I recognized from the funeral. He'd been near the front, in a dark suit, with the kind of face that suggested he smiled often and meant it rarely. He was Roman's second-in-command. I'd worked that out, by the way. Everyone else in the house deferred to him. His name was Gareth. I found that out in the next 30 seconds. "She's still here," Gareth said, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I assumed she'd have been dealt with. "Ivy," Roman said, not looking away from Gareth. "Can you tell me when you first noticed me breathing?" "At approximately 2:47 in the afternoon," I said, based on the order of events at the reception and when I'd last refilled the water stations. I was close to the casket for about 20 seconds before I confirmed the pulse. No one else was within earshot. "And who did you tell?" "Brendan, within 30 seconds. Roman looked at Gareth. "She found it in under a minute," he said. "You told me he'd be undetectable for 6 hours. Something shifted in the room. The temperature, almost." Gareth said. "The sedative compound was." "You told me 6 hours," Roman said again. His voice hadn't changed. That was the frightening thing. It was exactly the same tone, the same volume. "You sourced the compound. You arranged the transport. You told me 6 hours, knowing it would be less, knowing someone might notice before the burial." He paused. "She's catering staff. First-year nursing student. If she noticed, anyone paying attention would have noticed. You wanted someone to notice." Gareth stood up. Brendan, who had been standing behind me, moved in a way that suggested the situation was being managed. I stayed very still. "You didn't want me dead," Roman said almost thoughtfully. "You wanted me exposed. Alive, but in the wrong hands. That's a different kind of message." What happened next was handled by people who were equipped to handle it in ways I wasn't and didn't need to be. I was walked out of the study by a woman who appeared from somewhere I hadn't noticed and guided me back to the kitchen with the firm competence of someone who did this regularly. She made me tea. We didn't talk about what had just happened. Roman found me in the garden that evening. He sat down on the bench across from where I was standing, which was unusual. He typically stayed in motion, I'd noticed, rarely settling. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the sedative. "He's been with me for 11 years, he said. I didn't say anything. I didn't think he needed me to. I don't usually." He stopped, started again. "I'm not someone who talks about things like this. You don't have to." "I know." He looked at the garden. It was a September evening in Toronto, the light going golden and sideways through the maple trees that lined the property. "I'm telling you because you stayed. You could have left. You had a dozen opportunities in the last 4 days to walk out that door, and you didn't." "I'm not exactly sure why I didn't," I admitted. "I think you do know," he said. "I think you're very honest with yourself, Ivy McAllister, and I think the honest answer is complicated." He wasn't wrong. The honest answer was that I'd stayed partly because I was afraid of what leaving might mean, and partly because the work of helping him recover had satisfied something in me that my clinical rotations hadn't yet reached, and partly, the part I'd been least willing to look at directly, because I'd found myself not wanting to stop knowing him. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now the situation with Gareth is resolved," he said, in a way that made it clear this was a fact and not a discussion point, and the people who were working with him are identified, and I go back to being publicly alive, which will require some explanation to certain parties. A pause. "It's complicated. Most things worth doing are." He looked at me. "I want you to know something," he said. "What you did, noticing, staying, the things you said in that room today. That protected me in a way that had nothing to do with luck. You're not someone who stumbled into this. You're someone who paid attention. I told you. It's a professional requirement. It's more than that, he said, and you know it. I looked away, at the maples, at the light going out of the sky. A streetcar bell rang somewhere beyond the property wall, the specific sound of a Toronto evening, the city going about its business completely unaware of whatever this was. I have a clinical placement Monday morning, I said. 8 a.m. at St. Joseph's. I know, he said. Brendan looked into your schedule. For security purposes. Of course he did. You'll go, Roman said. I'll have someone make sure you get there safely. And when you're ready, if you're ready, I'd like to see you again. Without the circumstances. I turned back to look at him. This powerful, complicated man who had spent the last 4 days letting me take his pulse and argue with his physician and sit in his kitchen in the mornings like I belonged there. Under normal circumstances, I said, as close as I can manage. I thought about what normal might mean, applied to this, what it would require from me, and what it might offer in return. I thought about the nurse at the hockey game in Mississauga, and her certain hands, and how I'd spent years trying to build that kind of certainty in myself. Maybe certainty didn't always look like you expected it to. Okay, I said. Ask me properly then. And he did. The following Monday, I walked into St. Joseph's at 7:58 a.m. in my scrubs and my hospital ID, and I placed my stethoscope around my neck, and I went to work. Nobody in that ward knew where I'd spent the previous week. Nobody knew about the house in Rosedale, or the open casket, or the man who was not dead. Nobody knew about the garden bench, or the September light through the maple trees, or the way I'd said okay, like it was the simplest thing in the world, when it was actually the most complicated thing I'd ever agreed to. That was fine. Some things belong only to the people who live them. A month later, Roman Vasari took me to dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy that didn't have a sign on the door and didn't need one. He wore a dark jacket and asked me questions about my week, and listened without looking at his phone, and somewhere between the bread and the main course I thought, this is what I stayed for. Not the intrigue, not the danger, not even the certainty that I'd done the right thing by pressing 2 fingers against a wrist and telling the truth about what I found there. This, a man who paid attention, who let me be exactly who I was without asking me to be smaller or simpler or easier to manage. I'd walked into a funeral expecting nothing, and come out the other side with something I hadn't known I was missing. I'd found it in the most unlikely place, between a heartbite and a silence, in a cathedral full of lilies on a Tuesday afternoon in September. And I wasn't letting go of it.